Welcome to this Overseas Visitors Bite-Size session. I am Vicky Horton, the Overseas Visitors Manager for East Sussex Healthcare NHS Trust. The National Health Service Act 2006 and the National Health Service Charges to Overseas Visitors Regulations 2015, as amended, set out which visitors are required to pay for NHS hospital treatment. There is a statutory duty for all NHS hospital trusts to make sure that all patients are ordinarily resident in the UK or otherwise exempt of charge. This therefore is something we are required to do, and where the patient is identified as not being entitled to free care, we are required to obtain money from the patient for the NHS hospital services they are receiving. There is no option for us to not charge. We may very well feel sorry for the patient, but that does not have any bearing, or the ability to be able to pay has no bearing on whether or not we actually have to raise a charge to that patient. Furthermore, where the charges apply, we have to recover them in full in advance where the care is routine and planned. So basically, as the slide says, unless actually asking for payment would delay the provision of treatment that is urgent or immediately necessary, we should be asking for upfront payment. So who is an overseas visitor? Because you're probably sitting there thinking, well, that's an obvious question, isn't it? It's got to be someone that's visiting from overseas. And whilst it does include people that are genuine visitors to the UK, the concept of being ordinarily resident is much wider than that. The categories that are listed on this slide, it actually relates to people that would not be ordinarily resident. And if they're not ordinarily resident and the overseas visitors team can't identify another reason why they might be exempt of charge, these groups would usually be expected to have to pay for their NHS hospital healthcare. It is the overseas visitors team that takes care of that, though. There is a definition relating to ordinarily residents within the Overseas Visitors Regulations, but broadly speaking it means that a person is lawfully settled for permanent reasons in the UK. Lawfully settled. So they actually have to have the lawful right to be in the UK, and then they have to be actually living here. So British citizens can be affected just the same way as non-EU nationals and also EU nationals. British citizens if they don't usually live in the UK, non-EU nationals if they don't have indefinite leave to remain or have been subject to paying the immigration health surcharge, EU nationals who don't have status under the EU settlement scheme or a visa after the 1st of July 2021 to be in the UK for more than 6 months. Anyone that is ordinarily resident in the UK must not be asked to pay for NHS hospital services, and it is the Overseas Visitors team that will work to identify if a patient is ordinarily resident or not. So how do we know if a person is ordinarily resident in the UK? We should be trying to ask all of our patients where they have lived during the last 12 months. And if that's been the UK, then as long as they are actually a UK national or an EU national with status under the EU settlement scheme or a non-EU national that has a valid visa, then we wouldn't expect any further action. And it might be the latter 2 points that need to make the patient be referred to the Overseas Visitors team so that we can check the lawful side of somebody being in the country. If we ask the question of the patient and they haven't lived in the UK for the last 12 months, then definitely a referral should be made to the Overseas Visitors team, who will then endeavour to confirm whether or not the person is ordinarily resident or otherwise exempt of charge. And staff should be on the lookout for people that tell you they live overseas in a European country, because notwithstanding Brexit, EU nationals can still have a European health insurance card, and we can quite legitimately ask them to provide their documents when they try to seek NHS hospital healthcare. As covered on an earlier slide, if a person needs to be living in the UK on a lawful and properly settled basis, then without identifying the nationality of the patient, we cannot then work out what they would need to be lawfully in the UK, and therefore, hopefully from that, be ordinarily resident. So whilst entitlement to free NHS hospital care is not based on nationality, it is that will assist us to identify whether or not we need to seek more information from the patient, and that would be the Overseas Visitors team that is seeking that extra information. We might need to check for evidence if the person is non-European because they need a visa. They might be British as well, but if they're not, then they need a visa. If they are European, then whilst they can still come back and forth and in and out of the UK quite legitimately and without any problems, if they're planning on staying here on a settled basis, then they may need to have a visa or status under the EU settlement scheme. Finally, if the person's British, Yes, they have the lawful right to be here, but if they do not usually live in the UK, then they may very well be affected by the overseas visitors regulations. So understanding the nationality of our patient is quite critical in terms of working out the lawful side of being ordinarily resident. So there are some commonly held misconceptions around what makes a person entitled to free NHS hospital healthcare, and these are on these slides. These are some of the common ones that we come across from staff and from patients, relating to having an NHS number, being British, having been born in the UK, owning property in the UK, and paying taxes and national insurance. So having an NHS number is not an automatic reason for a person to be entitled to free care. So whilst information is joined up with UK immigration now, so that on the NHS number will be details relating to an EU national status if they have it under the EU settlement scheme, and also a non-European person if they have a visa and paid the immigration health surcharge. Being British only applies if the person also lives in the UK. So again, being British is not an automatic reason for free NHS hospital healthcare, same as being born here in the UK. That doesn't grant you any automatic entitlement for free care. If a person owns property and pays taxes and national insurance, whilst both are not automatic reasons for free healthcare, if the individual is living in that property and they are working in the UK and therefore paying UK taxes and national insurance, both would be ways that the person can prove that they are settled in the UK for ongoing reasons. We must avoid discrimination when trying to identify if a patient is ordinarily resident, and the only way we do that is by making sure we have a process that asks everybody the same thing. And we can clearly say that we haven't picked and chosen who we're going to ask. We have a process that is asking everybody to confirm if they are ordinarily resident in the UK. These questions are intended to be asked every time a patient begins a new course of treatment at the hospital. The outpatient kiosks do include a question, and there are a number of ways that the overseas visitors team identify possible chargeable patients in advance of treatment happening as well. There are some areas in the hospital that are free to overseas visitors just by the nature of what the service is. The first one is accident and emergency services, which are free to all. But it only is A&E department or an area that is given equivalent to A&E that is free. We do have to consider whether or not we have any equivalent A&E services, and in some cases we have had to look closely at whether or not the time spent on Kipling Ward, Scott Unit, SAU, AMU, the same day emergency care unit is actually equivalent to A&E or was a decision to admit the patient. The overseas team have to look at that because we do record it on PAS as a short stay admission, but was it actually an admission or could it be treated as equivalent to A&E? The main discrepancy that we have in this area is the assumption by our staff that the care is emergency and therefore it must be free. I don't dispute that lots of care is emergency, but it's not the fact that it's emergency that gives it free to the overseas visitor. It's the location that gives it free to the overseas visitor. So once the care might still be emergency, they might still have come in via an ambulance and have needed to have an emergency operation and be admitted onto an inpatient ward. Once that has happened, charges will apply even though the care was emergency in nature. On this slide are some other exempt services. So if a patient is actually receiving treatment in relation to any of these or in any of these areas, then they would be free of charge. But there is an element of the overseas visitors team trying to confirm certain circumstances to make sure that the individual does actually meet the exemption. For example, the last one in terms of whether or not the individual has travelled specifically to the UK to seek treatment. If they have, it's not free, even though the type of care might be the type of care mentioned in that bullet point. If they have an infectious disease, then that's obviously with the clinical confirmation that it is on the list of infectious diseases named within the overseas visitors regulations. And where a person has had to have palliative care, which we have had with ESHT, and that was a case of confirming that the place the patient was going to was a registered palliative care charity. This slide covers the other exempt reasons where somebody isn't ordinarily resident, but they can still be entitled to free NHS hospital treatment because they meet one of these things. You'll notice the third bullet point is talking about the European Health Insurance Card. Even though the UK has left the EU, the European Health Insurance Card system and similarly the PRC, which is a provisional replacement certificate, does still apply. All of these would require the overseas visitors team to seek some additional information, usually from the patient, but it can be from a parent or it can be from a local council if the person is being looked after or supported by a council. So the next few slides are covering the types of care as they are described within the Overseas Visitors Regulations and what happens in respect of an overseas visitor receiving this type of care. The first one is immediately necessary, and this type of care should never be stopped or refused. Maternity services are immediately necessary care, and there are other services that would be immediately necessary care as well, and they are defined within the regulations as care that is to save a patient's life, to prevent a condition from becoming immediately life-threatening, or to prevent permanent serious damage from occurring as described on this slide. It is really important that this type of care is never delayed, subject to the overseas visitors team reviewing whether or not the patient is chargeable. If the patient is identified as required to pay, then payment would be sought as quickly as possible after the care has been received. So this slide covers urgent care, which, as it states right at the bottom, it is care that is considered by a clinician something the patient needs before they can reasonably be expected to leave the UK. Now, there are going to be situations, if you consider some of the definitions of what is an overseas visitor, where the actual person who is an overseas visitor isn't leaving the UK, and then the clinicians need to consider whether or not the situation is needing to be dealt with urgently or would be reasonably be okay to wait. The overseas team do seek support from the clinical teams regarding this assessment, and we do ask for upfront payment, but it's not stipulated that they must pay in order to have the treatment, so it isn't delaying the treatment again if they cannot pay. Some outpatient care would be considered urgent. Some examples for that relate to 2-week wait services and oncology, and usually all inpatient admissions would be considered urgent care when the patient has come via A&E. So this is the third type of care within the Overseas Visitors Regulations, and as it states here, it is care that in a clinical opinion is not urgent or immediately necessary, and therefore it's not needing to happen very quickly. Where charges apply, they must be recovered in full in advance of providing treatment. So where we've identified an overseas visitor and we know they need to pay because they're not exempt of charge via some other reason, then we have to identify the estimated costs of care, invoice the patient and seek the upfront payment from them. If they cannot pay or do not want to pay, then unfortunately the care cannot go ahead where it is routine care. The overseas team will request that the patient is discharged from further care and appointments are cancelled. The overseas team also contacts the relevant GP, because most of these are coming from GP referrals, to advise them that the patient is not entitled to NHS hospital care, so the GP is aware should they be asked to re-refer the patient in future. EU nationals had freedom of movement before the UK left the EU. They could come backwards and forwards and just travel on their ID card. As a result of Brexit, this is no longer the case, but they still can come as a visitor without a visa or status under the EU settlement scheme, but they would have to pay for NHS hospital care. They actually have to have travel with a passport rather than their ID card. If they needed to have status under the EU settlement scheme and do not have it, they would become chargeable for NHS hospital care until they sort out their lawful right to live in the UK. And if they need a visa and do not have one, again they would be chargeable for NHS hospital care. So all of that comes down to identifying if they lived in the UK for the last 12 months and what nationality they are as to whether or not we actually need to be seeking confirmation of their EU settlement scheme status or whether or not they need a visa. So the Overseas Visitors team use the summary care record quite a lot because we have a process that's called MESH, which actually matches all of our activity against the summary care record and identifies possible chargeable patients. This does generate quite a lot of cases that we need to have a look at. Now, if you have access to the summary care record, you may become aware of banners that are across the top of the records for these patients, and they are 3 different colours: green, amber or red. Green banner can mean a number of things, usually that the person has entitlement to free care because they are lawfully in the UK, although there are some situations where we have to check residence as well. Amber banner can also be to do with the immigration status of a patient in terms of the EU settlement scheme, but it also can be new NHS numbers and other situations relating to adoption or transgender. If you see a red banner on an NHS number, it is always worth a shout to the Overseas Visitors team because a red banner can mean the patient would be chargeable. Temporary visas will not show on the summary care record, so just be mindful of the fact that people can be in the UK with visit visas and we wouldn't know unless we'd asked the question where they've lived for the last 12 months. So as this slide requests, we have come to the end of the presentation today, and I hope that you found it useful. Please discuss this amongst your teams and identify where you can be making sure that we are meeting our statutory duty for patients to be lawfully resident in the UK and entitled to free care. Really important that please do never tell a patient that there is no charge, even if they are in A&E and you know A&E is free at the time, as the patient may take this away thinking all NHS hospital care is free. And as I've said earlier in this slide, that's not the case at all. And emergency care, whilst we won't stop it, isn't always free to patients. If you are unsure about a patient's status, then please contact the Overseas Visitors team. And we very much appreciate your help and assistance with making sure that we meet our statutory duty. And I'm just going to leave you with one final thought, that if you actually identify you or colleagues would like any training from the Overseas Visitors team that would be specific to your area and how we might be able to help you or how you can help us, then please let us know. Please be aware that the contact details on here, the best ones to make sure that we have received your contact if you are referring a patient, is our email. So please do bear this in mind in terms of contacting us. The phone numbers relating to the soft phones, the 770286 and the 770287, whilst they do have a voicemail on it, they are linked to our laptops, which therefore will only reach us during our working hours. Thank you.